Hello, thanks so much for attending our press conference today, which provides a human rights-based approach to the Ukraine crisis. I'm your moderator, Katie Halper. I'm the host of The Katie Halper Show and co-host of the Useful Idiots podcast. And today's call will feature 6 congressional candidates who have formed a new left coast alliance to address the complexity and nuance of the situation and provide proposed solutions dubbed as a 3-3-3 plan. The candidates will discuss the impact of this conflict, what it could have on both the 2022 midterms, as well as America's readiness for a new kind of foreign policy leadership emerging from the left. We will have brief remarks from each candidate, followed by a question and answer session at the end. The first speaker is Rebecca Parson, candidate for Washington's 6th Congressional District, who will speak on the history of Russia and Ukraine, including the 2014 coup.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you to everybody for being here. I think it's important, and we all do with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to look at the history that led up to this moment. Putin's invasion of Ukraine is illegal. The US should stand against it. And his justifications and excuse for going in, that he is trying to prevent genocide in Ukraine, is wholly inappropriate, because the term genocide itself was created after World War II to create something specific for the unique atrocity of trying to wipe out an entire people, the specific war crime of trying to wipe out an entire people and their culture and history from the earth. And so that is not happening in Ukraine, and it is completely inappropriate and an unjust, absurd excuse for Putin to use in invading Ukraine. And we need to stand against his illegal invasion of Ukraine and try to bring it to an end by negotiating with him over the real concerns, the real things going on here in this crisis. And going back further, we can see that when the Soviet Union was collapsing and talk of reunifying Germany was being had, we made promises, the West and the US, to the collapsing USSR, that if Germany was allowed to reunify, that NATO would not expand 1 inch further east beyond Germany. And of course it has, and Russia views that as a threat to its own territorial integrity and to its security. Additionally, during the 2014 Maidan coup, it was a far-right coup led by a minority of people in the country, and with a lot of involvement from Western powers, especially the US, and the think tank apparatus. Our funding of far-right Nazi paramilitaries led to a lot of the chaos and a lot of what happened in the 2014 coup. And then as we look further to what's been happening recently, Zelensky and the Ukrainians had been saying for weeks and months that they did not think Russia was about to invade. They asked the US and the West to, especially the US, to tone down our rhetoric and to stop ramping up the heat on this by saying that an invasion was imminent. We kept going, we kept throwing fuel on the fire. The invasion then occurred. We also have to look at the context around this. Beyond, Russia feels that its territorial integrity is threatened, so it has responded by violating the territorial integrity of another country. Outside of that, we also have to look at the other factors going into this. For example, the climate change and the need for fossil fuels that is driving a lot of this conflict. The background that has not been talked about very much here is that the US has been selling more fracked gas, or LNG, over the years to Europe, and especially to Germany. And now that Nord Stream 2 is effectively dead, Germany has just recently started building more LNG infrastructure to receive LNG from the US. So now that they are not able to get that fossil fuel from Russia, they are now trying to build infrastructure to get it from the US, which the US, of course, will benefit from. Ultimately, what we need to do to tone down the rhetoric and to bring a peaceful end to this conflict is to negotiate with Russia, not to impose sanctions, which will be talked about later. And we have to remember, with all the warmongering that's going on in the mainstream news, Russia is a nuclear power, as are we. And the largest nuclear stockpile in the country, if not the world, is actually in my congressional district in Washington state. And so the threat of nuclear war hits close to home. For that reason and many others, I urge Biden and the US government to negotiate with Russia to end Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine and avoid direct conflict with a nuclear power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for those sobering words. Our next speaker is Jason Call, candidate for Washington's 2nd Congressional District, who will address the history of the U.S. conflict and wealthy oligarchs driving war on both sides. Jason.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, media in attendance, and thank you, fellow candidates. We are conditioned in the U.S. by our own form of nationalism. We call it patriotism here, and it's highly weaponized against critics of Western imperialism. Our public school history classes tend to indoctrinate students with a whitewashed history of how America was settled, and we've only just seen beginnings of movements to address people in this country who have been historically marginalized and oppressed by expansion and colonialism on the North American continent. But what is never addressed is the dark history of U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the modern era, post-World War II. And what I mean by that is a reckoning is required of the impact of wars like Vietnam that we know were now driven by false flag events like the Gulf of Tonkin, like Iraq, where we have yet to hold accountable the Bush administration for war crimes against the Iraqi people or address the war profiteering of companies like Halliburton with direct ties to the administration, or Afghanistan, where we must also address the war profiteering over 20 years of companies like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Raytheon, who made trillions off suffering in Afghanistan, and the failing post-war policies that have now created a humanitarian crisis 10 times that of the Ethiopian famine in the 1980s. Furthermore, the last 70 years of U.S. policy has seen at least 60 U.S.-supported coup attempts worldwide. The list of verifiable intervention attempts, some successful, some not, being documented by historian William Bloom and involving almost every country in Central and South America, and dozens of others in Africa, Asia, and Europe, including, as we have mentioned, Ukraine in 2014. Many of these coup interventions have been against democratically elected leaders who could be described as leftists and came to power through support of their own citizens because they were promised release from the economic oppression of foreign companies who are extracting their own national resources. And of course, the first that come to mind are Iranian President Mohammad Mossadegh, Chilean President Salvador Allende, and Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz. The involvement of the CIA and various corporate entities in these coups is not even disputed, and the regimes that followed were brutal. In fact, for decades, right-wing paramilitary groups and death squads were trained at the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia, under the auspices of helping those nationals aid their US-backed governments in brutally repressing popular movements that might threaten US interests. And we interpret that to mean continued exploitation of national resources by US corporate interests. So this is our long history as a country, which is, by the Pentagon's own definition, terrorism that is achieving political or ideological goals through violence, fear, and intimidation as methods of coercion. Thus, when we have a situation now with Russia and Ukraine, and we appeal to China to use its influence on Russia and apply pressure for cessation of hostilities, well, you may have seen the response of Chunying, Minister of Foreign Affairs, who said, "When it comes to respect for state sovereignty and territorial integrity, I'm afraid the US is in no position to tell China off," and remarked on the US NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, which killed 3 Chinese journalists. I encourage everyone to read that communication. What we need immediately is an avenue to de-escalation of violence, and in particular, a revival of the movement for global nuclear disarmament. However, the history of the United States and its clear and long-standing motives to make the world safe for US corporate interests, both in word and deed, make it very difficult for other nations to trust that their dealings with the US are in good faith, particularly when the US is the world's largest arms dealer and fairly indiscriminately supplies brutal regimes with the means to cause havoc and death. And I would be remiss if the hypocrisy surrounding arming Israel and Saudi Arabia weren't noted, 2 countries that to this day inflict dire circumstances on the Palestinian and Yemeni peoples. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. And now we are going to be hearing from Maybe a Girl, candidate for California's 30th Congressional District, who will speak about the human costs of war.
Hey everyone, my name is Maybe a Girl. My pronouns are she, her, and they, them, and I'm running for the U.S. House of Representatives in California District 30. It's an honor to be here amongst so many candidates for peace. I'd like to speak on the human impacts of the conflict in Ukraine and of war in general. As with all conflicts of war, there's a profit motive for warmongers, as well as economic consequences for everyday people in those regions affected by war. Some folks will make fortunes while everyday people will suffer and die. The value of human life should never be given a monetary value. Yet, even though the US is not formally engaged in the conflict, the US war profiteers and the politicians they financially support are gaining at the expense of everyday Ukrainians stuck in the middle of this conflict. Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and Lockheed Martin have seen their stocks go up as Ukrainians fear for their lives. I'm personally outraged that politicians who consistently vote for war and who are funded by these weapons manufacturers, such as my opponent Adam Schiff, are feigning sympathy for Ukrainians. What we need to supply is humanitarian aid, not arms, not troops, and certainly not for our own financial and imperialist gains. Humanitarian aid will include food, water, and medical aid, as well as shelter, but it must also include granting refugee status to Ukrainians seeking sanctuary in the US. As a fiat state, there's no question that the US can financially afford it. And again, you can't place an arbitrary monetary value on human life. This is especially so when US corporations and the politicians that they fund are able to financially profit from the conflict at the expense of everyday people. Ukrainians are fast becoming casualties of imperialism, and we must resist entering into the military conflict under the guise of fighting Russia. Adam Schiff has said, the United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there, and we don't have to fight Russia here, which ultimately decenters Ukrainian refugees, 1 million of whom have already fled Ukraine, by focusing on US-Russian relations and setting the stage for another proxy war. Hundreds of Ukrainian casualties have already been reported, including the deaths of Ukrainian children. This is to be condemned. Furthermore, we must remember that everyday Russians and Russian Americans are not responsible for this conflict. It's the greed of their imperialist leaders. The US also engages in imperialism, bombing poor countries, supplying arms, and sanctioning nations, which ultimately affects those nations' most marginalized people. It's not okay in Ukraine, and it's not okay anywhere else. It's not okay in Yemen, it's not okay in Afghanistan, and it's not okay in Somalia. People are people, and they deserve dignity and opportunities to thrive. To conclude, any involvement of the US in Russia's invasion of Ukraine must be limited to actual humanitarian aid and refugee assistance, and no military involvement whatsoever, regardless of the American military-industrial complex, perhaps missing out on some quick cash and imperialist power. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maybe. And now we're going to be hearing from Stephanie Gallardo, candidate for Washington's 9th Congressional District. She'll be talking about the consequences of interventionism and the implications for 2022.
I can't start my video.
Sorry about that.
Thank you so much. My problem was being too well known. As a politician, I had contacts all over southern Chile. Sure enough, my name was on a military edict published the day of the coup on September 11th, 1973. I kept asking myself, why should I be hunted like a deer? My party has been legal for the past 32 years. This was democracy, wasn't it? It was the 19th. It was a night I don't want to remember. There was nothing refined about the torture. I was beaten mercilessly, kicked, pummeled, spat upon. They took me to a presidio called Chin Chin, 1,000 prisoners in 27 cells. 2 miles from Chin Chin was a torture center. You could hear the screams from that far away. They took me there one night and placed electrodes all over me, even the most sensitive parts. When the current was turned on, I bit my tongue so hard, the blood flowed out of my mouth and down my neck. I couldn't scream. I was choking. So they turned it off and cleaned me up. Then a soldier said, "Listen, dummy, you don't have to make any noise or cry, or you didn't make any noise or cry. That's bad. Now we're going to begin it all over again." And they did. This time, I screamed my head off, The foam spewed out my mouth. Only then were they satisfied. It's strange. After a while, you begin to prefer one form of torture over another. You say to yourself, oh God, I hope they only beat me this time. Knock out a few teeth. Anything but the electrodes. It's a complete breakdown of self. The words you just heard were my grandfather's. His name was Atilio Gallardo. In 1970, he was elected as a socialist city councilor in Los Muermos, Chile, the same year that Salvador Allende was democratically elected as the first socialist president in South America. Following the US-sponsored coup on the Allende administration, my grandfather was kidnapped and illegally imprisoned for 2 years and 11 months. My grandmother, who had 3 children with my grandfather, went into hiding until the entire family was granted freedom and brought to the United States by the International Rescue Committee. You see, in war, the people that suffer are our families. In light of the ongoing occupation of Ukraine by Russian forces, I'm sharing the details of my family experience with you today because while the actors and historical circumstances are different, the commonalities are obvious. Whether through military dominance, economic power plays, or covert operations, what's clear and historically irrefutable is that imperialism has blood on its hands. For years leading up to 1973, the United States instituted various economic sanctions on the Chilean government, leaving everyday Chileans like my family completely destitute. The generational consequences of reckless interventionism are unmatched. As the daughter of a refugee forced to flee his homeland as a result of US intervention, I long for a land I wasn't born in. I'm bitter that my family was split across 2 continents and that my father couldn't say goodbye to his family in Chile before he died from cancer in 2020. It is the small moments, the personal moments that imperialism can never account for. In war, the only winners are corporate profiteers. Now in 2022, the people of this country have a choice. Do we fall deeper into the myth of American imperialism, where our military play global police and our elected officials haphazardly direct billions of dollars into imperialist ventures that result in death, doom, and destruction? Or do we take note of our history and move toward peace, recognizing that it is the working class that suffers the consequences of war, never the oligarchs? In 2022, voters up and down the West Coast will discover stark differences between corporate-backed Democratic candidates and the candidates you see before you today. Let today serve as the first day in a historical movement toward global peace and justice. We must reject corporatism, which fuels militarism and oligarchy. We can no longer accept militarism as an unspoken necessity. We must take a hardline, anti-interventionist approach in all our foreign policy endeavors. Finally, as Americans, we must call to question the blatantly racist treatment of Black and brown-skinned refugees in contrast with the rightful global outpouring of support for Ukrainians. Yes, of course, Ukrainians deserve safety. Our biggest priority in the coming months should be resettling Ukrainian refugees and providing them with governmental services to aid in their healing. But do we ever stand with Palestine? Do we ever stand with Afghanistan? Do we ever stand with Iran, Pakistan, or Somalia? In what ways are we individually and nationally complicit with creating a global class, second-class citizenry? Moving forward, we must state loudly and clearly that if we stand with Ukrainian refugees, we stand with all refugees. Finally, the great hope in these times does lay with refugees. 45 years ago, my grandfather was being tortured and held captive as a result of a US-sponsored coup on a democratically elected government. Today, in 2021, his anti-imperialist spirit lives on through me and the rest of his grandchildren. Today, we will lead a new generation of leaders demanding peace and global cooperation. History is ours, and the people will make it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for those really moving words. Next is Shahid Bhutar, a candidate for California's 11th Congressional District. He'll address how the Ukraine crisis invites an opportunity for America to diversify Congress and remove incumbents complicit in militarism.
We've all been down this road before, watching a bipartisan war machine spin the facts and hide the facts to distract the American people from crises that are all too apparent in our communities, crises that are very present at our dinner tables. And one reason I'm so proud to stand here among my allies up and down the West Coast today is because the representation in Congress remains distinctly lacking, particularly as we're talking about a West Coast political culture that remains appropriately skeptical of military industrial interventionism, that remembers Eisenhower's warning and recognizes the dynamics that co-opted so much of Washington long ago. I'm glad to see military intervention taken off the table recently, but we're also eager to repudiate other more indirect examples that might be less visible of militarism, like, for instance, sanctions targeting civilian populations. Stephanie depicted the history of torture supported by a Chilean government installed after a CIA coup in 1973. And I'm forced to recall that our own country's record of human rights abuses remains secret. As senior US Senator from my city, Dianne Feinstein, decried on the floor of the US Senate a constitutional crisis under the Obama administration over the suppression of the Senate's investigation into CIA torture. That report remains secret to this day. And the pretense that the United States has any legitimacy to defend either democracy or human rights anywhere in the world simply ignores the documented history. And we remember it. And we're grateful for the opportunity to inform the public about it as well. These double standards don't just rest in history either. It's not just double standards with respect, for instance, to human rights, where we've seen the US absolutely undermine the principles that we now claim to stand for disingenuously. But these human rights abuses and double standards continue today at our nation's borders, and they remain visible from Ferguson to Jerusalem. The Ukraine crisis, we hope, might offer America an opportunity to diversify Congress, not just demographically in the way that so many of us here today would present the opportunity for our respective districts to do so, but crucially intellectually. And I want to draw a comparison here with the judiciary. We're all excited by the nomination of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to join the Supreme Court, not only because of her demographics, but particularly because as a former public defender, she has an experience and a set of expertise poised to inform an institution that lacks them at the moment. And her addition to the Supreme Court, should the Senate ratify her nomination, would not only be a good thing for the law and for jurisprudence, but institutionally for the court, in the same way that our respective elections would be good for Congress and its capacity to better represent the full spectrum of we the people of the United States. There's a particular voice on the West Coast political culture that is inclined towards visionary alternatives and sees through much of what seems to repeatedly on a recurring basis confuse and distract so many voices in Washington. And this is not a recent phenomenon, nor is it particularly isolated at any point on the West Coast. I'm thinking of here and recalling the general strike of 1934 in San Francisco, or the founding of the United Nations, which happened here 10 years after that. In the era of the Vietnam War, the free speech movement and the resistance to that war on Vietnam stretched up and down the West Coast. My beginnings as an activist really started in watching the Battle of Seattle from far away and coming to understand that there was and remains an active grassroots movement wielding direct action to challenge militarism within the United States. And then it was under the Bush administration and the run-up to Iraq, organizing starting in 2002 that dragged me out of my chair. And the siege to San Francisco's financial district in 2003, or the international longshore and warehouse unions shutdown of the ports across the West Coast in 2003 to stop striker brigades from being shipped to Iraq. These are examples of the kind of assertive, visionary, independent political culture of the West Coast that is entirely absent in Washington. In 2020, just 2 years ago, I'm thinking about not just the protests around police violence around the country, but particularly the very escalated resistance and suppression of grassroots dissent, the paramilitary suppression of grassroots dissent in Portland. And I'm thinking of also this weekend where demonstrations organized by groups including Code Pink are going to be organized in cities up and down the West Coast, from Seattle to Los Angeles, including here in San Francisco. I'm grateful for those voices. I'm proud to stand alongside my allies up and down the West Coast today and presenting an alternative to the militarism that dominates both of the corporate political parties in Washington. And while I would say some progressives have offered thoughtful and needed dissent on foreign policy, and I do want to particularly credit voices like Ilhan Omar and Barbara Lee in having played that role, they have tended to focus more on domestic issues while accepting too many of the Pentagon's and the CIA's self-serving lies. And that voice of the West Coast that we offer, that we represent on this gathering today, it remains silenced in Congress, but the crisis in the Ukraine makes it more relevant than ever. And that's part of why I'm so grateful for you all being here today to help bring that crucial and institutionally overlooked perspective to the public.
Thank you so much, Shahid. And lastly, but not leastly, we are joined by Shervin Azami, candidate for California's 32nd Congressional District. He will present the group's 333 plan and solutions. And you should also be receiving an official press release with statements and the full plan in your inboxes about that. But without any further ado, Shervin.
Thank you very much. The U.S. foreign policy apparatus has reflexively used sanctions as tools of war for decades to strong-arm adversaries to bend to our political will. With the dollar as the world reserve currency and most nations conducting virtually all international transactions denominated in the dollar, it means that if and when we decide to impose economic sanctions, they can cripple an economy. But crippling an economy is not the same thing as holding despots and authoritarians accountable. Indeed, the near universal sanctions that have been on the books for years or decades on countries like Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and North Korea have achieved nothing to foster democracy, end corruption, or empower workers and citizens to take power back from their governments. What they have unequivocally achieved is to depress the financial and physical health of working class people, cause severe inflation, which disproportionately hits the poor citizens, and create a vacuum for even more corruption and even more virulent authoritarianism. Right now, the Russian people are standing up to Putin's imperialist war of aggression. They oppose this invasion and are risking their lives to protest against it in the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg. Those sentiments may very well change when, as a result of our sanctions, their wages turn worthless and the cost of their basic goods skyrocket as the shelves grow emptier and emptier. Our sanctions are a form of monetary imperialism. And make no mistake, it isn't just the Russian people being hit by sanctions as a result of this war. We all know energy prices are skyrocketing because the West has chosen military escalation over diplomacy. So what does the Biden administration do? Grovel to the Saudi government to increase oil production by reimposing sanctions on Houthi fighters in Yemen, despite the catastrophic human rights consequences. So in other words, we are punishing a people thousands of miles from Ukraine, a people who have suffered genocide and mass suffering at the hands of the Saudis in a war financed by US aid and US weapons. How is that sensible foreign policy? How does that promote peace and prosperity and democracy? The answer is that it doesn't. It never has. It's an egregious lie that has created incalculable amounts of human suffering and only fomented greater antipathy towards the United States. The only route to energy independence is through a Green New Deal that permanently ends our reliance on fossil fuels. We don't punish oligarchs by punishing ordinary citizens, period. All that does is create an environment for those very oligarchs to then exploit to further entrench their power. In fact, the crater-sized holes in US anti-money laundering laws means that these sanctions on oligarchs and their yachts are performative bluster at best. Oligarchs the world over, American or Russian, love to hold their assets in private investment funds, private equity, hedge funds, and real estate investment trusts. US law does not require owner disclosure for these types of assets, which means they're anonymous. How can we sanction an anonymous investment account? I don't see any benefit for global peace by reestablishing a financial iron curtain over Russia. We see the opposite. Isolationism breeds hypernationalism, which is the perfect environment for authoritarian actors to consolidate their power. It is indefensible that not once has President Biden called for a multilateral diplomatic ceasefire. Indeed, war hawks like Adam Smith, Brad Sherman, Rick Larson, and Adam Schiff are literally saying the quiet part out loud in terms of US intentions. They want Ukraine to be a prolonged and expensive military quagmire for Putin, just like the invasion of Afghanistan was for the Soviets in the 1980s, which of course turned into a proxy war between the US and the Soviets, just as Eastern Ukraine has been since 2014. Let's remember that proxy war in Afghanistan led to mass starvation and displacement, with over millions of Afghan refugees, while weapons makers and oil companies made record profits. And of course, our decade-long financing of the Mujahideen and the political turmoil left in the wake of that war created the environment for the rise of the Taliban. There is seriously little more dangerous than historical amnesia. Our response to Putin's despotism must be diplomacy. That is why our alliance has put forth 3 short-term and 3 long-term solutions grounded in protection of human rights. They are as follows on the short term: solidarity with anti-war protesters and immediate delivery of humanitarian aid, such as food, medicines, and shelter; refugee resettlement and asylum for Ukrainians and other displaced peoples, including thousands of African students within Ukraine currently; and immediate international brokering of a multilateral ceasefire. Those are the 3 short-term solutions. The 3 long-term solutions include codification of a new Minsk agreement to include self-determination for the Donbas region, written guarantees Ukraine will not join NATO, and a revival and expansion of nuclear disarmament treaties. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shervin, and thank you so much to everyone who has spoken so far. Also, thank you so much to people who are turning in. At this time, we'd like to invite questions and answers. If you have a question, please type it in the question box in the bottom menu of your screen, and we will get to those shortly. I can kick off with questions while people are writing them in. I have one question, which is, how did this come together? How did this idea to do this 333 plan and this press conference come together?
I'm happy to speak to that unless anybody else wants to jump in. So, I think we've all been watching the media discussion in particular defer to Washington, and I think taking heat in our respective districts for taking an independent line, seeing through some of the lies. And someone on our team particularly noticed a post from Jason Call, where Jason overtly recognized the potential threat to his campaign by taking an independent stance, and acknowledged it and said, that's what we're here for. And even if it costs me this election, I'm here to speak the truth. And that resonated with me very much. And we organized amongst ourselves. We're all organizers ultimately, right? In addition to political candidates, and recognizing this gap in the discussion. Initially, thought very tactically about, how can we respond to this crisis in the Ukraine. As we did that, I think a further set of objects of consensus revealed themselves, from the policy prescriptions in the 333 plan to this idea of forming a left coast alliance and offering this voice, not perhaps just on this issue, but that structurally has been excluded from Congress. And I think we're all excited to stand together and to be a whole greater than the sum of our parts. I've certainly been very inspired to encounter the voices and have a chance to work alongside my hopefully future colleagues.
I want to ask you, while we're waiting for more questions, Shervin, if you could connect what you spoke about. I know Stephanie connected it very much to her family's trajectory. If you could connect what you spoke about to your own family's history.
Yeah, absolutely. My parents fled religious persecution in Iran during the time of the revolution back in 1979. Just 26 years after our government here deposed the only democratically elected leader in Iranian history, Mohammad Mossadegh, which Jason Call spoke about. The town my family was from was erased because it was known to be a stronghold for the Baha'i people, which is my family's religious background. I cannot travel to Iran because of my last name. So I am no stranger to despotism and authoritarianism. And I'm also no stranger, my family is no stranger to the impacts of US imperialism and militarism abroad. We need a new foreign policy grounded in human rights, grounded in diplomacy, not in further militarism, not in further occupation. We have seen how these decisions have only fomented greater antipathy, have caused mass suffering across the globe, and have only entrenched the power of oligarchs, oil companies, and defense contractors at the expense of working class people here in the United States and across the globe. And so I think we all recognize that in this moment, as we barrel towards climate catastrophe, this must be our time to divest from systems of oppression and put that money into our communities to ensure that no one's zip code dictates their fate, and to ensure that here in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, that poverty should not be a policy choice. And so instead of endless wars, instead of further military escalation, instead of further occupation, our communities need those investments, need those resources here.
Great. Thank you so much for that response, Shervin. We have some questions coming in. One is if you guys could go over, and some of you have already, but again, and we haven't heard from all of you on this, what the positions of your opponents, the incumbents, are on these issues, what positions they've taken thus far.
Happy to start, if that's okay with everyone else.
Sure.
My opponent, Brad Sherman, a senior member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who's taken hundreds of thousands of dollars from defense companies, including Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman. He was on MSNBC last week saying the Ukrainians don't want humanitarian aid. They don't want refugee resettlement. They only want more weapons. And he was also one of the members who said the quiet part out loud in terms of US intentions, which are to, again, like I said, embroil and ensnare the Russians in a protracted military quagmire, just like we did with the Soviets in Afghanistan. So the goal here is not peace. The goal here is not a ceasefire. The goal here is not protection of human rights. It's to just further be able to embroil other nations in these fights and in further war games to entrench the power of oligarchs here at home and abroad. And these are the sentiments that we're hearing from so many other incumbents as well. And Brad Sherman even made an egregious comment that we should be flying US planes over Ukrainian airspace with UN flags monikered on them to see if Putin will shoot them down. Literally risking nuclear war just to prove I don't know what point.
Wow. Can't make that up. Maybe, do you want to go next? I'm just calling on people as they appear on my screen.
Yeah, absolutely. So I I briefly spoke about this when I was speaking earlier, but my opponent, Adam Schiff, very interesting establishment Democrat, because a lot of people consider him to be a hero based off of his words against Trump. And I've always said, you know, being against Trump is about the lowest bar a politician can have. And, you know, he made this statement the other day, again, that, you know, we're supporting Ukraine so that we can fight Russia over there and not fight Russia here. And there's really a lot of things to dig into that statement. You know, I think, first of all, by starting off by saying we support Ukraine, that's what he's hoping that his followers will listen to. But in reality, it's the following part of that statement that is really revealing that we can fight Russia over there and not here. So what it does is, again, it decenters Ukrainians and makes this about US versus Russia, which again sets us up for this proxy war. And, you know, for a politician like Schiff, who has been in office for over 20 years now, he's voted for every single military conflict since he's been in office, for Iraq, Afghanistan. He voted to support the Saudi invasion of Yemen. So there's no doubt in my mind that he would also support military intervention related to that conflict. And that is something that, just taking a look at all military conflicts in recent history, is something that we absolutely want to avoid, not just for Americans, but for people overseas, for people who are actually in the places where these conflicts are happening.
Great, thank you. Shahid.
So the incumbent in the district I'm running to represent in Congress is the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. And she has a decidedly prolific role with respect to entrenching US militarism. She's presided over and whipped votes favoring every proposed military spending increase for the last 34 years. Well, she's presided over everyone for the last decade and supported everyone before that. She has a particular role I should zoom in on with respect to CIA torture. I mentioned that before following Stephanie's remarks when she had described the torture that her family members had encountered, and the role that Pelosi had in being briefed by the CIA into what the CIA called enhanced interrogation methods as early as 2006, and then abjectly failing the affirmative obligation under international law that we fought a World War to establish, obligating any state actor to seek accountability in response to any credible allegation of torture, rather than cover it up, as Pelosi has done for the last 15 years. Now, it gets even worse than that insofar as when we think about torture in particular, one of the few members of Congress to push this issue and call for the US to respect international human rights is Representative Ilhan Omar from Minnesota. And she has repeatedly been demonized by Pelosi for doing that. And the idea of a powerful politician, an oligarch herself, Pelosi, punching down and left at a refugee in Congress, calling for overdue respect for human rights in order to cover her own potential legal liability, is disturbing to say the least. And the conflicts of interest don't frankly end there with Pelosi. Much of the discussion about the crisis in Ukraine has centered on the role of Russian oligarchs. I'm running against an American oligarch. She's the 7th wealthiest member of Congress. She has long filled her pockets at the public's expense through insider trading, while blocking every proposed progressive policy reform of the last generation, from Medicare for all to the Green New Deal. And she's done that while ducking debates and the co-optation, not just of the West Coast political voice that I was describing before in our region's political culture, but even just baseline tenets of democracy by the leader of the party that calls itself Democratic is an irony not lost on me. And I am particularly eager to, in our context, not just have an opportunity to represent my city in Washington, but frankly, to remove from Congress an agent who has played such a crucial role in entrenching the bipartisan consensus supporting the military-industrial complex.
Thank you so much. Stephanie.
Yes, so my opponent, Representative Adam Smith here in the Washington 9th, he is arguably one of the most powerful players in this situation. He is the chair of the House Armed Services Committee. He has been on this committee since he was first elected to Congress in 1999, I believe. And, you know, in that time, he has made more than one mistakes in terms of his votes. He voted for war. He continues to profit in terms of his campaign from campaign contributions from military contractors. 1996, thank you, Jason. And, you know, what I think is most important to point out here is some of his most recent commentaries. I'm just going to read them really quickly for you. This is a quote from Adam Smith. "The United States can speak with experience about how limited an effect 150,000 troops can actually have in a country. And Ukraine is a bigger country than Afghanistan, certainly in terms of population. And we need to be prepared to support them in that fight. I think we need to be prepared to support that insurgency in a similar way that we supported the insurgency in Afghanistan." And so what really stands out to me here is that the vote he consistently says that he regrets having made, that, you know, was a pro-war vote. He clearly in this statement didn't learn those lessons that he says he learned. And so, you know, for me, what continues to be something that weighs heavy on my mind is the fact that, you know, this extremely powerful person, the chair of the House Armed Services Committee, is really doing the bidding of war on CNN, on MSNBC. You see him all over the place right now, speaking and really trying to hold a hard line on interventionism as if it's okay. And, you know, I would just say, you know, to conclude here, there's a stark difference, you know, as I mentioned in my speech, between the people who are on the screen and the people who are currently in office. And the difference is an anti-war and pro-peace platform that we all have. And the difference is that we are also not benefiting from our, elected positions, although we're not elected. Many of these folks who are in elected positions, as Shahid mentioned, are benefiting financially, are benefiting in many different ways. And Adam Smith has benefited hundreds of thousands of dollars of money from military contractors. So that's what I'll say. Thank you.
Thank you. Jason?
Thanks, Katie. Yes, I am running against a member, fourth-ranking Democrat of the House Armed Services Committee, Rick Larsen. Been in office for 20 years, very much backed by the military-industrial complex and the fossil fuel industry. And it should be noted that his 5 biggest donors from the military-industrial complex are the same who were identified as the biggest profiteers of the 20-year-long Afghanistan conflict, which he voted against withdrawing from 6 times until it had political approval from President Biden. He has made statements about wanting to cripple Russia's economy, which, as we have talked about, is going to hurt ordinary Russians who are bravely in the streets protesting their autocratic government. He has hearkened this conflict back to the Cold War. And when it comes right down to it, he is backed by the same people who are going to profit from this, and since they are bankrolling him so heavily, he is counting on them to refund his campaigns now and in the future. He has never been a voice for peace, and I believe this district, even though we have, as Rebecca noted, her district, which is right across the Puget Sound from mine, is home to arguably the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world. We also, in my district, have 2 naval bases, and people here don't want our district impacted by war. We don't want to send. We were seeing reports of Russian soldiers who have surrendered to the Ukrainians, knowing intimately that what they are being asked to do by their leader Putin has been wrong. And I think about the people in my district. I was a high school teacher for almost 20 years. I think about the people, my students who early on in the run up to Iraq and Afghanistan wanted to sign up to the military coming right out of high school so that they could go and fight in those wars of aggression that were based on lies. And they were asked by their governments to do terrible things. And I think the Russians are being asked by their government to do terrible things also. And I really want people to have compassion for soldiers who are being put in a situation that they don't want to be in, that they don't belong in, and remember that it is not the people of Russia who are responsible for this. It is never the people who are responsible for this. It is always the governments, and we have to look, pull the curtain back and look at the people who are pulling the levers of power here. And Rick Larsen is one of those people.
Thank you, Jason. And Rebecca?
Yeah, my opponent, Representative Derek Kilmer, is ranked by GovTrack as the 15th most conservative Democrat in the House, and that's reflected in his donors and his votes over the years and in his approach to the Ukraine crisis. He's funded by fossil fuels and the military-industrial complex. That's why I call him a Chevron Democrat, because he is a Chevron Democrat who opposes the Green New Deal. And when you look at the stocks of fossil fuel companies after Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, they all skyrocketed, and I don't think that's a coincidence at all. So, for example, just one of Derek Kilmer's fossil fuel funders, Chevron, their stock skyrocketed after the invasion. Then we look at LNG. There's an LNG holding facility, a storage facility in my district that is deeply unpopular, that we activists on the ground have been protesting for years and years and years to no avail. And what's happened? LNG, which is fracked gas. Production of fracked gas LNG has increased in the US over the last decade or so, and so have our sales of that to Europe. And in fact, Germany just now recently, since the effective end of Nord Stream 2, they've started increasing their production of LNG reception facilities from the US. So we see with the military industrial complex funders and fossil fuel funders, these companies that are funding my opponent and many, if not all of the opponents of my colleagues here on the call, they stand to benefit. And so how can we expect our incumbents to take the right stand when their donors are benefiting from this war? It just doesn't make sense. And so you can see that with my opponent, Derek Kilmer. His approach to leadership is not to be a leader at all. It's just to wait until Pelosi and Biden give approval for something. And then he comes out and makes a tepid milquetoast statement, like I stand with the Ukrainian people, sunflower emoji, and then maybe a picture of him standing on some steps with some people, you know, Ukraine, go Ukraine. And then he might say something, he'll say something like sanctions. Yes, we're going to have sanctions and sanctions are good, after everybody else has already come out in Congress saying, yes, we should have sanctions. And so the one statement of any kind where he puts forth an opinion, as opposed to just trying to fade into the wallpaper, is wrong. Sanctions do not work. Shervin gave a great presentation on why sanctions do not work, and they will not impact. There's no such thing as targeted sanctions. We've done our targeted sanctions. We hear on the mainstream media that these targeted sanctions are more targeted than they've ever been. But then we see that regular, everyday Russians can't take cash out of their bank accounts. They can't pay for things anymore. They can't get to work because they can't use the subway station. It's impacting regular people. And sanctions have never worked to achieve our goals, our stated diplomatic political goals. What they have done is just ratchet up tensions and grow the military-industrial complex more and more and more. And so what we need to do is go and negotiate with Russia to bring an end to his illegal invasion of Ukraine. And none of our opponents, including mine, are doing that. They're not stepping up to be real leaders and say, this is what we need to do. This is the right thing to do. This is how we end it, so that the Ukrainian people who are under shelling and attack, and the Russian people who are suffering under our sanctions and under Putin's crackdowns, we need to go to the table, negotiate with Putin to bring this to an end. And then when I look here at my own district, you know, we have the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the entire country, which means probably the entire world as well. And so it really hits close to home that we are flirting with engaging in direct conflict and starting World War III with a nuclear power, because where are those nuclear weapons going to come from? Right here next to where I live and where all of the residents of my district live. And we're here in year 3 of the pandemic. We have inflation at 40-year highs. We have the president in his State of the Union saying that the economy has roared back, but it hasn't roared back for the 1 in 5 kids who are hungry, the 600,000 people who are homeless, including many people in my district, and the people who are just struggling to get by, working gig jobs like me, driving DoorDash while running for Congress just to get by. And so what people in this district want is not, they want safety and security. They want a job, a home, healthcare, and education. These are the things that people in my district and across the country want. It's also what people everywhere want, Ukrainians, Russians. And so we need to promote, you know, our opponents are not, they're not going to step up and be leaders on this. So that's why we are with this Left Coast Alliance. And I really urge Biden and the US government to negotiate with Putin to bring this illegal invasion to an end.
Thank you so much. Any final thoughts? We have about 30 seconds from each of you if you have any final thoughts. And if not, we can just wrap, because this has been a great event. But I think we may have covered everything.
If I can just step in, I just want to say how proud I am to stand with my candidate colleagues here. And we are really hoping that we can start a movement with other people running for Congress and let people know, as Shahid said, we need a diversity of ideological voices in Congress that are lacking right now and have historically always been lacking. And while we are 6 people on the left coast right now, we hope to expand this alliance and welcome anybody in who shares our positions on this.
Only thing I'd add to close with is just my thanks not only to the Russian people for standing up against their powerful autocratic government and an illegal invasion, but also the Americans who have stood up against the US militarism and the antagonism that we've seen in a policy that is centered escalation over de-escalation. And as a candidate for Congress, I think this might be, I won't speak for all of us, but I certainly see the opportunity for we the people of the United States and we the people of our respective countries to hold our respective governments accountable. And you've heard a theme today about how, you know, this state violence and patterns of international wars for profit are never in the interests of the people who are claimed and the people who are used as shields and as swords against each other. And those of us in all of our various countries who are beating those swords into plowshares, I just want to thank and offer that appreciation as someone aiming to represent that voice in Washington, and just profound thanks to everybody here, each of my colleagues speaking. I'm really looking forward to having an opportunity to make policy with you, because I really do see in this conversation how much we're poised to offer our country together.
Agreed. You're here.
Here.
Great. Well, thank you so much to everyone for participating in this, and thank you so much to everyone who came to watch this. And yeah, I salute you all for your independence and bravery, because it's not easy to come out with these positions during the times when they're most needed. So thanks again. Bye, everyone.